I think we're rolling. Happy Thursday, everyone. I just returned from a very quick walk to the coffee shop because Constance and I went to our Thursday Trader Joe's parking lot thing. But anyway, what you're looking at is an original drawing by David Wilson. Now, he drew this in 1981 of the Enochian spirit Ladrum. Okay, I'm going to talk about that in just a second. And this also is an Enochian vision of the misspelled. Or there's a long story involved with that. Maybe we'll touch on that later. But this is a vision, okay, and we published it in our little lodge quarterly in 1981, spring of 1981. This is our Oye, or as we pronounced it in those days, Oyez magazine of Haru Raha Lodge. Okay. I'm going I advertised that I'm going to talk about it, the senior in my bedroom. Okay. Now, this is return with us now to those thrilling days of yesterday. 1981, Haru Raha Lodge was chartered in 1978. And so the lodge had been going, we had been initiating, and I had established a weekly class. At that time, the class was on Thursday, where we did sort of the obligatory teaching fundamental magic things that most everybody learns at first, the pentagram rituals, hexagram rituals, and things like that. And eventually, I was doing really good to just sort of stay one week ahead of the class in my own education and experience. And when I started get tired of the pentagrams and the hexagrams and the greater and the lessers and things like that, out of boredom, I reached to the one of my best book in my library at the time, which was Gems of the Equinox, printed by Llewellyn. I've got it sitting right over there. And it had several excerpts from the Equinox series, the original Equinox series, that dealt with Enochian magic. So I thought, hey, well, that should be a good workshop. We'll all learn Enochian magic together, kind of thing like that. And so I started out a class like that. And eventually, and I didn't have much to work with. I did have a 2-volume set of the Golden Dawn, or what was published by Llewellyn at the time, the Golden Dawn, Regarde's expose, I guess, of Stella Matutina rituals and education plan. But that's all I had. Okay, I was, believe me, it was 10 years, 1981 was 10 years before I wrote this with Dr. Hyatt. Okay, and it was like 17 years before I would write this. Now, in 1981, if I would have read either of those, but especially if I would have read this, it would have been a whole different kind of class. Okay, it'd be a class like I'm hoping to give here in Sacramento in the next few months. Be that as it may, I would like to read to you an essay or an article that was written by our lodge member, David P. Wilson, who was a talented cartoonist and author. You may know him better today as the author S. Jason Black. And he also provided a cartoon for this Oyez. And here's Dee and Kelly. There's Kelly at the scrying crystal, and there's Enochian tic-tac-toe board there in the background. And Dee is saying, they want us to swap what? It's a joke on the episode where the angels told Dee and Kelly to swap wives. So that's Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly, great figures in occult history. Anyway, the first, I had done just several personal Enochian magic experiments, and I sort of, I got the idea that specific calls open up specific areas on the elemental tablets, and if you wanted to deal with spirits of the or intelligences, I guess would be even better, of the elements and the sub-elements and things like that. For instance, air of water. Okay, the air sub-angle off of the elemental tablet of water might give you the spirit after you sort of go into a little trance after doing the call. The spirit may appear to you as a living, talking bubbles in Perrier water or something like that. And you could talk with them and communicate with them and ask them questions about what their nature is and what they do, concerning you. Yeah, just the stock stuff. And the earth of fire might be, speak to you in a big clump of burning coal or something like that. But it was all very experimental, and we only had a couple of documents to work with. So we were flying by the seat of our pants. And I want to read David's essay contribution for this Oye, called Senior in My Bedroom. Now, we had like a 4-ton, I mean, it was huge and heavy, and it was probably about a 1920 or 1919 multi-lith printing press that somebody gave to us, and our other lodge member, John Fullerton, who was very mechanically inclined, got working. Okay, it looked medieval. And we had it out in the garage. It looked like a locomotive engine. And you had to make metal plates for every page that you printed. Okay. And it was out in the garage, and it was cold and dirty and ink, and it was so cold in the garage that we had a can, an oil drum can, and all the paper that the waste paper that we made, we threw it in the can and burned it for warmth. And so it looked like a printing press in hell. And we were all smudged with ink and things like that. And Constance would bring us out tea and things like that. And that's how we printed this. And it's yellow because the paper, very heavy, almost cardstock paper, was donated by somebody. But we had to make every page with metal plates, and some of them turned out uh, good, and some of them didn't. So much of the printing of his essay is like this. And over the years, I've taken time to put it in more readable format, or at least that obscured section. And I'm going to read the story because this is our first experience with scrying, our first experience with Enochian magic, and in this case, off the elemental tablets, our first experience of a group working, our first experience with recording it on a cassette recorder, and I think I've still got the tapes rotting away here somewhere. And it was a perfect portrait of young magicians experimenting, embarking on the adventure of Enochian magic in 1981. Senior in my bedroom, or My Actions with the Enochian Spirits by David Wilson. From Oye magazine, a private journal published for the members and friends of Haru Raha Lodge OTO. Spring Equinox issue 1981 EV. When I first heard the announcement that there would be an Enochian workshop, I was excited. The OTO activities in Southern California had included, with the exception of the Gnostic Mass, very little in the way of group workings. And I had always felt rather like the spiritualists, that there was greater, or at least different, potential of unusual results in a group setting rather than working alone, especially in evocation. I was also very interested in the practical use of the system of Dr. D, which had been mentioned, either wonderingly or disparagingly, but always briefly, in almost every book of magic and the history of psychic phenomena I had ever read. The meetings of the Guild of Enochian Studies, that's what we called our Thursday night thing. I think we had a regular other magic class. Anyway, for many years we did 2 classes a week in our home lodge. Let's see. And we called it the Guild of Enochian Studies, or GOES. GOES. Were set for Thursday evenings at the home of Lon DuQuette, who initiated the idea and taught the first several meetings to familiarize everyone attending with the history and structure of the Enochian system, or so much as I knew from Gems of the Equinox and the Golden Dawn. I'm afraid it didn't take long because, as we soon discovered, in spite of the much that has been made of the Enochian work of Mathers and Crowley, almost nothing was known about the system itself and its genesis. That would take me 17 years to do that. And that's only because of the great work done by Robert Turner and uh, Clay Holden and Joseph Peterson. Okay, all of those scholars. Help me finally put that one together. Okay. Let's see. Further, I personally concluded after trying to read Dr. D's actions with some spirits, and that's the true and faithful relations. And I'm not sure where David got a copy of that. That Kabbalistic correspondences aside, the system, as has come down to us from the hand of the 19th century practitioners, was mostly guesswork. On reading the published version of Dee's notes, I was surprised to find no mention whatsoever of his initial contact with the entities which gave him his information or how it was achieved. I'm digressing here too much. That had to wait for the distribution at first in that thermal paper copies of Dee's diaries from the British Library that had been stored on microfiche and then distributed in those copies. I was lucky enough to get a set of that probably about 6 weeks after this was written, so I could get an idea of what was going on and that additional very important Enochian material. Okay. As the book opens, after profuse apologies to the Pope, etc., by Dee, most of the system has been given by a Seth-like. The Seth Speaks. It's a famous metaphysical book popular in the 80s about channeled material. Most of the system has been given by Seth-like beings such as Nalvij. And while that's a very important communicating angel with Dee and Kelly, like Nalvij. And while the events surrounding the reception of the calls is covered, so much that would be useful to know was left unsaid or so badly written that it left the reader mostly in the dark with headache and eye strain. We were finally left with the simple existence of a magnificently complex and alien occult system, which it was difficult to account for historically, and evidence for the validity of what was 400 years old and incoherent. The only person in the group who seemed to have done any work at all with Enochian was Lon himself, who mentioned that the angels he called, rather haphazardly as he told it, responded to his requests and even appeared to him in dreams when asked. I arrived at Lon's house one evening to find a smaller than usual group setting up an altar and erecting a cardboard chart of the Enochian square representative of Earth. One of those other class, I'm digressing so much here. One of those class members, Donald Rose, I hope Donald Rose is well and happy, brought a brand new hardbound copy of a book called The Complete Enochian Dictionary by Donald Laycock. An Enochian dictionary. Now, Laycock wasn't an occultist. He was a linguist that was totally blown away by the fact that the Enochian angelic language, as received by Dee and Kelly, was in fact a bona fide language of some kind, and it blew his mind. But anyway, Donald Rose was another one of the class members that showed up with that book. I might add after that night, that book stayed with me. It was freely offered, don't worry. I didn't Svengoolie. Okay. Okay. Svengali, I meant. Okay, smaller than usual group setting up an altar and erecting a cardboard chart of the Enochian square representing Earth. I mean, it was big. It's about 4 feet wide. I was working at a medical device laboratory, and it was one of the shipping containers, and I took it home and made giant elemental tablets that we could use for class. This was being used because the square, the wooden one being made for the workshop, which were being constructed of wood, hadn't been finished yet. A short time later, I had semi-volunteered to scry. Well, he semi-volunteered because no one else volunteered. Okay. And everyone gathered inside a circle, and the circle I made out of clothesline, a clothesline cord, a clean new one, which later we disposed with as irrelevant to the system. That was the only time we did. I was being overly cautious. And Lon performed the banishing pentagram and hexagram rituals, after which the book was handed to me so I could recite the call. I had never read the call before that evening. And regarding the spirit to be called, I was only given a name by Lon, which was Laidrum, Laidrom, and was told that he was a senior, one of 6 commanding the element, and nothing more. Knowing nothing about his attributions, even the planetary ones, I didn't even tell him that Laidrum was a planetary senior of Mars off of the Earth tablet. Until the session was over, I didn't tell him who it was or what board he was on. The landscape appeared under a cold white sky, and I must say that after David read the call, he just simply closed his eyes and almost immediately began speaking. The landscape appeared under a cold white sky, the ground level to the skyline, and covered in white crystalline powder, like salt, or as someone later pointed out, cocaine. Rising from the plain, there were great gray pillars of volcanic rock. Okay, hang on a second, because those pillars appear, let's see here, in that illustration I showed you. Okay, there's the pillars, and they're flattened on the top. As of yet, that cone had not popped up. They're flattened at the top, and they sort of look like they were holding up the sky. Okay. Of volcanic rock. Natural formations, but still almost straight in their attitude, and flattish at the top as though intended to support the sky. Between these, and scattered throughout the landscape, were pits wide enough to sink a mastodon in, the bottoms of which I could not see from my angle of vision. Can you imagine how excited we were when David, almost immediately after reading the call, closed his eyes and described something like this? I was ecstatic. I was ready to call a class a success and shout it from the rooftops. But he went on. The landscape formed and remained static, but nothing further happened until I read the call the third time. He didn't mention that nothing much was going on the first time he read it, and the second time he read it, and then the third time he got things going. Then I closed my eyes, and a great black shape began rising out of the pit in the center of my field of view. There's that big thing. It was a cone, like a wedge of night cut from the sky, with little points and clusters of light inside it like stars, with tiny sparks of electricity jumping from one glowing point to another in a seemingly random manner. I mentally asked if this was Ladrum. In reply, a series of Enochian letters floated in front of the cone. I wrote them down as best I could, even though the image was very difficult to hold. It didn't translate very well until we reversed the spelling, as Dee had to do in the sessions. When this was done, and this is later, okay, when this was done, it translated to Edrom or Edom, which could either have been reference to the biblical kings of Edom or an attempt by Ladrum to spell his name, imperfectly received by me. I tend to favor the latter idea because the nature of the question and difficulty I had in seeing the letters. I had also better say that at this point I had no knowledge of Enochian alphabet other than the ability to recognize an Enochian letter. I could not translate Enochian letters into English. Now, Ladrum would eventually draw that sigil on the sand in front of him. Okay, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, so at the time, there was no angelic figure. There was just those Enochian letters floating around. This wasn't very satisfactory, so I asked for a clear reply. At this, a humanoid figure draped in a dark, sparkling substance which extended in flaps past his feet. In folds past his feet, but which clung tightly to the arms and head, and he appeared before the cone. It had no fingers, only mitten-like appendages, and no face, only a smooth, egg-shaped extrusion set on a neck where the head should be. Class was floored. You could hear a pin drop. Our mouths were agape. Without bending, the figure pointed at the white powdery ground and made several movements with the arm. There appeared at its feet a series of marks in the sand, as though a finger or stick had been stuck there to make the scratches. The marks that had been made were in the form of a square with two diagonal lines slashed across and a circle in the center lower left-hand corner, which I took to be, and since successfully used, as the sigil of Ladrum, even though none of us had ever really figured out what it is. Well, at the time, we've projected it on an elemental tablet of Earth and read the letters of the diagonal lines and the angels whose names might be included in that circle. Well, but I digress. The really odd part of the experience came right after this. I was describing to the listeners and the small tape recorder that had been brought what I was seeing. And I had the urge, very weak at first, but growing stronger, to, well, I can only describe it as a desire to make strange sounds with my mouth. I expressed this to Lon, and he encouraged me to relax and do it. I did. And at the time, I felt like an absolute fool. The syllables came from my mouth very haltingly. What I was experiencing was not what I would call either clairaudience or mediumistic possession, but a kind of subtle pressure to say words that made no sense to me whatsoever. I had at the time even less knowledge of the Enochian language than I do now, which is to say, none. So I was ignorant of what, if anything, was being expressed, as everyone else present. I kept talking until I felt there was nothing left to say. And since we hadn't prepared for any other specific question for the spirit, we hadn't been prepared for success. We ended the ceremony. Now, in my introduction to a modern edition of the Laycock's Enochian, where is it? Do I have it here? Laycock's Enochian dictionary. I share with you what the angel said, because we recorded it. And the angel said, once we it took about an hour, 40 minutes at least, to play the tape back forward and looking up the words one by one in the Laycock's dictionary. The words translated roughly into English: Spirit of Earth, First Worshipper Welcome Visit. A little section we couldn't adequately get. It says, hands stretch forth, conquer earth, find peace. First Worshipper Welcome Visit. From then on, we did Enochian magic 2 times a week for the next 3 years. Now, David goes on in a more legible manner in this essay of David, Senior in My Bedroom. And if you are interested, I will probably continue and finish reading this, what I consider a magically historic essay by David P. Wilson, who would later find notoriety as the author S. Jason Black. So, until tomorrow, continue to be good to yourself, be good to each other. First Worshipper, welcome visit. Do what thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will.